What are your thoughts on the latest state of the war in Ukraine? There's been a certain amount of political and diplomatic movement, maybe not moving very far in any particular direction. But what do you make of the state of things today, this evening?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the fighting, the war is effectively just grinding on, isn't it? The Russians are pushing very hard in the northern part of the eastern Donbass, where they're hoping to gain some advantage, but they're taking very heavy losses, and it's a real struggle for them, I have to say. And the Ukrainians are doing the same in the southern part of the eastern Donbass, and this is just grinding away with casualties on both sides. I think the Russians are taking more casualties and damage, but it's not going to break any deadlock at the moment.
Yes.
What is interesting is the ground is now frozen, and when the ground freezes in Russia and Eastern Europe, as we know from the Second World War and things like that, suddenly wars of movement can start. And there were talks about perhaps the Russians trying to do some offensive down from Belarus. I've heard no more of that now.
Yes.
But certainly, I think the Russians must be thinking we've got to try and do something, because this grinding away is eating away at their army and their stocks of weapons and supplies, and they're not really getting anywhere. The talk about some sort of ceasefire by the Russians, they would love to have a ceasefire. They would love to have that, but it wouldn't lead towards a peace. That is the worry, and that is the problem that Ukrainians have.
Yeah, I wonder if this sense of stalemate, is behind the news that General Sirofkin has been removed. He's been called, hasn't he, General Armageddon, for the ruthlessness of his approach. He served and led in Syria. Now he's been sacked. And Putin does seem to get through his generals, doesn't he? And his admirals too, for that matter.
He certainly does. I mean, we had a history in this country, of course, with Byng of shooting an admiral, and the French refer to this as saying it was pour encourager les autres. Whether Putin is encouraging the others with what he's doing, I doubt very much. I don't think he's taken necessarily advice from the army at times when he should have done, rather in the way Hitler didn't, of course, in the Second World War. But I think what has been exposed by this war so far is the levels of corruption and incompetence in the logistic chains and things of the Russian army.
Yes.
And I think some of those senior officers deserve to be focused on for that. And Putin clearly wasn't aware of those huge shortcomings within his fighting force.
Yeah, I mean, a headline I saw today caught my eye. It doesn't bear directly on the fighting in Ukraine, but it does on morale and moral support, and away from the front line in Ukraine. Here, there's a campaign, Lord West, to get churches across England to ring their bells on Ukrainian Unity Day at 11 o'clock, which, what do you think? Is that a valuable sort of campaign? It may have the effect, might it not, of consolidating support and awareness of the war in Ukraine at a time where there is a possibility of that interest and support waning.
Well, I think, I mean, that particular initiative, I'm not sure exactly what that'll achieve, but we certainly need to keep focus on this war, because there is a real danger of interest waning. If you just think of media reports, I mean, it's interesting, John, in your program, you do keep a regular thing going about Ukraine, but actually on the television news and on the wireless, one was getting constant reports of another missile strike here and someone killed there. That has all rather faded away. The big events are now reported, but a lot of it started to fade away, and I'm afraid there is a tendency of people to become news weary.
Yes.
And get fed up with something. And there is no doubt that a number of the countries in Europe would love there to be a ceasefire, but they haven't thought through what the implications of that would be, because Putin would not have changed his view that he believes Ukraine should be a vassal part of Russia.
Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, the war weariness you described there, it may also include our awareness and interest in the awful atrocities that we see continually coming out of Ukraine. When our justice ministers from a number of countries are due to meet here in London in spring with war crimes high on the agenda. What do you make of that? Do you think that sort of thing that has any effect on the battlefield? Is it in the mind of those soldiers and their commanders who are ultimately behind these atrocities?
I mean, I think we really must pursue these things, and it must be done with vigor. And so I think it's right that meeting is taking place, and we must pursue all of these instances of war crimes. Does it make a difference actually on the battlefield between the people fighting, the guys who are trying to make their advance into that city in the Donbass at the moment? I think very little. But to some of the commanders, I think they will think to themselves, if this goes wrong, will I be held responsible? So they will be very wary of, for example, giving messages to their troops that they should behave in certain ways. And I think that in itself is quite useful. But I'm afraid in terms of the day-to-day battle on the front line, it won't. And there's no doubt the Russians have actually carried out a number of dreadful atrocities. I think the trouble is, in these sorts of wars, you find that I'm afraid that on both sides there will be things that are happening, but the Russians, without a doubt, are far worse about this and have done some terrible things.
Yeah, and speaking of ruthless conduct of the war, you're seeing that the Wagner Group, that mercenary body of military outside the regular Russian military, they're now claiming credit for themselves. Their leader, Prigozhin, known as Putin's chef, he's claiming credit for taking full control, he claims, of Soledar, which is a fierce battle north of Bakhmut. I wonder what you think of that. First of all, it gives you an indication of some tension and a split inside the Russian military, which maybe you might welcome.
Well, certainly that was the town or city that I was referring to in terms of the Russian advances. I mean, the main Russian army, the purest members of the Russian army, particularly at senior levels, must be pretty hacked off that the Wagner Group are taking responsibility for doing these sorts of things and are being given so much clout and power by Putin. But I don't think they've been as successful as they're saying at the moment in around Soledar. And I think one has to be so careful because it's not just the Russians, of course, who are spreading propaganda. I'm afraid the Ukrainians, you can't always be absolutely certain of ground truth. And so, exactly what the position is there. I think what is clear is that the Russians are taking very heavy casualties there, and then this will be the Wagner Group taking it, but they're grinding away at the Ukrainians as well. It's a very bloody business, and it's not really moving very much.
Yes, and I suppose you could argue it maybe, at least in part, Prigozhin, their leader, the Wagner Group's leader, talking up his contribution, and a political motive in that sense.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is changing subjects. I think the possibility of us providing Challenger 2 tanks, which might unlock the issue of Leopard tanks and Abrams tanks being released to Ukraine is very important. A lot of people have a go at tanks and say, they're finished on the battlefield. I've never been a great believer in that because I've seen how much money is spent by nations on things to try and destroy tanks. If they were pretty useless, why the hell would they bother? There's no doubt if tanks are used properly, they are very, very important still on the battlefield. That means using them in mixed combat arms with infantry, using your UAVs and things like that, your drones. And there's no doubt, although it's only a small number, I think we're talking about 12 possibly being released of Challenger 2s, they are incredibly capable tanks. If used properly, they can make a difference to that one area they're fighting in. And if it unblocks the flow of other tanks to Ukraine, that will make a difference. That certainly would make a difference in blunting any attack by any large-scale attack by the Russians from the north or whatever, but also enabling the Ukrainians to move forward in a tactical way in various places as well.